So here's a debate on the a debate on the modern day debate being moderated by Praise the moderator, and the two competitors here in the debate are CJ Cox and Jim Majors. And I've had conversations with all of those people before, and so that's been pretty good. But here I was very impressed with CJ's opening statement on Moses and the Exodus and the question of whether Moses existed. So we're going to go over that in another video. CJ and I will, but let's listen to this.
The thesis before us today is obviously a pretty interesting one. It's a vital one to the faith, I think, of any Christian or Jew. It's obviously a vital one to the question of Israelite history and how well we know it and whether or not the Bible can be trusted. And interestingly enough, even though it's one of the older mythicism questions, having its origin all the way back in the late 17th, early 18th centuries, it's actually not one that is as commonly debated as, say, whether or not Jesus or Muhammad or even King Arthur existed. The position which I, of course, seek to defend in bringing this up again is that Moses did, in fact, exist, and that he did at least relatively the same things as what he did in the Bible. I believe the Bible literally, but I just want to point out, for the sake of argument, I am willing to grant that it's possible that, for example, numbers can be exaggerated for the 600,000 or something like that. I would say basically that does not indicate Moses' non-existence any more than the fact that none of us believe that 1 million Persians showed up at Thermopylae indicates that Leonidas or Xerxes didn't exist or that the Battle of Thermopylae didn't happen. So even though I do believe those numbers and also believe the writing of the Pentateuch was done by Moses, I'm not actually here to defend those per se, because I don't think that those things actually indicate, if they're not true, a lack of Moses's existence. So I'd like to go ahead and jump right into the points that I have today. The first piece of evidence that I would like to put forward is actually the Bible itself. The fact that the Bible says Moses existed is, of course, evidence that he did exist. Now, I want to be clear, this is not one of those the Bible said it, therefore kind of arguments that you might hear from like a preacher or something along those lines. Rather, my point is to say that the Bible is an incredibly old collection of texts. Many of those texts at least present themselves as the history of the Israelite people, and all of these texts seem to indicate whenever something like Moses is, or whenever the era of Moses is brought up, that there was indeed a Moses there, that he led an Exodus, that the Exodus came out of Egypt, so on.
Okay, so let's just build on that. We know that the Bible consists of over 40 different authors wrote the Bible. So this is not just one independent account. These are a bunch of independent accounts. We also know that there's 66 books of the Bible written over 1,500 years in 3 languages and 3 continents. Moses' name is mentioned in quite a few books of the Bible, which CJ is going to talk about. But Moses' name is also mentioned 847 times, divisible by 7. Interestingly, all the Bible passages in the Bible itself, many of the verses, things like that, are divisible by the number 7. It's fascinating. Ivan Panitz put a lot of that together. But beyond that, let's go back to this.
And so forth, right? And in the self-same way that the Sumerian kings list, or, you know, looking at a inscription of Amenhotep or something like that, the same way that those would count as evidence for such and such a person's existence, even if we don't necessarily believe everything in them. Likewise, I would say that the Bible certainly does indicate very strongly, of course, that Moses did indeed exist as a historical figure. It's worthy to point out at this point in time that the Bible story as a source for Moses, or the Bible as rather a source for Moses, without the word story there, does actually meet all of the various criterion of authenticity by which scholars use to deduce which things in history and legend are true and which things are not true. For example, he meets the criterion of, multiple attestation in the fact that not only is he mentioned all throughout the Torah, which, although in my view that would be one source, in the majority of scholars' views that's certainly multiple sources, but he is also mentioned in the book of Samuel, in the book of Kings, in the book of Isaiah. He's alluded to in the book of Amos and in the book of Hosea, so on and so forth. We see multiple witnesses, multiple textual witnesses to a tradition that indicates that the Israelites at least believed that Moses was a historical figure. He also meets the criterion of embarrassment, being showed on some instances to even be kind of cowardly, to be rebellious and to not want to actually follow God's commands, outright telling God no, having a speech impediment, striking a rock, and therefore not being allowed in the promised land, so on and so forth. We see it meets the criterion of coherence, Namely, it has the self-same story every time that it's told. There might be minor differences, and those differences are certainly things that people can discuss, but it's never going to be something along the lines of, like, for example, Hercules, where in Greek legend, you don't even really know what era Hercules is supposed to live in, let alone what he did. Is there a core story somewhere? Probably, but we don't really know what that core story is, although a lot of people think that it is probably the 12 labors. But he shows up in the Trojan War. He shows up, in this, that, and the other kind of myth. You look at Moses, though, consistently the story is coherent, consistent, and it's the self-same details in the self-same order. All of these things are indications that Moses, of course, does exist. It's also important to note that as far back as you can push Israelite history, Moses and the Exodus are there. What I mean here is that the oldest surviving Israelite writings, which are, of course, found in the Bible, if you take the traditional view, that would be either the Torah or Job. If you take modern scholarly consensus, that's probably Amos, Hosea, or Isaiah. Doesn't really matter, because all of them indicate that Moses is somebody who is accepted as a historical figure at that point in time. The oldest manuscript we have of any Hebrew writing whatsoever is a scroll found in an amulet from around 650 BC. The scroll not only is a quotation of a book believed to be penned by Moses, Numbers, specifically Numbers 6, 24 through 26, but it's actually a direct quotation of a blessing that Moses passes on to Aaron. You've all read it before, or at least heard it before. It's, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. If, like I said, a lot of modern scholars suggest that Amos, Isaiah, and Hosea are probably the oldest surviving biblical texts. Amos and Hosea explicitly allude to being pulled out of Egypt, and Isaiah outright uses the name Moses on top of the fact that it alludes to the Israelites coming out of Egypt. So as far back as you can push Israelite history, there appears to be a acceptance of Moses and of Moses's existence. More so than that, though, you actually have even better examples of what, at least in my opinion, of evidence that Moses did exist. For example, even if you assume that Moses did not write the Torah in its totality as we see it today, you still have certain things within the Torah that are claiming to be written by Moses, and that indeed are claiming probably to be pre-existing the Torah in its final form. For example, Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, is a song that is believed to be penned by Moses. So where did that come from if the person who is explicitly credited to doesn't exist? You could say the same thing for Psalm 90, and there's a couple other good examples as well. The law itself, the common, documentary hypothesis today, usually it suggests that there is a Yahweh source, an Elohim source, a priestly source, and a Deuteronomist source, right? And that these four sources are what make up what we now know today as the Torah. Now, ignoring the fact that we don't have any evidence whatsoever that any of these four sources actually exist, no manuscripts, no schools of thought, nothing like that. At least two of those sources sound suspiciously like the story of Moses, namely lawgivers, which you would expect from a Deuteronomist source, and those who worship the God Yehovah. That's the second instance that actually would be something that I think would, or the third rather, because we're on the law now, that would be something that I think would indicate proof of Moses's existence is worship of Yehovah. Where did this God come from? This God is not anywhere in any culture outside of the Bible and the Israelite tradition. It is the claim of the Israelite people that the person who actually set up Yehovah worship in Israel is Moses. If Moses doesn't exist, then where did this God come from? Why did he come from? Who set up this worship? Why did people accept it? So on and so forth. You could ask questions such as, where do the priests get their legitimacy from? Where does this tabernacle information from? The tabernacle one's a fairly interesting one, because if Moses did not exist, and indeed the time period which he's believed to have existed in did not happen, then all of the painstaking detail about how you set up the tabernacle and how you build it and how it is to be set up in camp and so on and so forth was set up for no reason at all other than to be there. Entire sections of Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, made pure fiction, mind you, made simply to exist, having no purpose whatsoever and recording no actual historical facts. That is absurd in my view. You have things like the origin of Passover itself. Passover is a very interesting thing because, first off, it is not only the origin of the holiday itself is grounded in Moses and his existence, but also the celebration, the tradition of celebrating it, is also founded in Moses. To give you
So these are all really good arguments, I think, that Jim would have a really hard time overcoming.
people have used stories to explain their origins. Since ancient times, people have told stories to try to establish a provenance for their historicity. It's something that validates their religion, in spite of other religions existing and other cultures existing, claiming to have ancient origins. And to do this, we often see texts that attempt to establish their early origins by creating a history to fit their narrative.
So the bottom line is he's going to make an argument that the history comes after the narrative. So they crafted a narrative and then had to create a history. That is something that sounds, it sounds absurd on its face, because I can't think of any other examples in history that somebody could make that claim. History occurs. People tell stories to remember the history and to repeat the history, and stories are a great way to keep things in memory. And so the Passover is not mere, we're creating a narrative. We have a narrative, we made up a religion, and so now we're going to make up a history. That's not a very logical assessment. But those are the kind of arguments that you will get from the so-called skeptic camp. And Jim Majors is one of those people. And so I want to say thank you so much today for liking and subscribing, if you will. So please do that again. Please come again. I want to say enjoy the holiday weekend, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter, Jesus' resurrection. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all in the glory of God. Thank you so much.